Uh, Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You are very welcome at the online literary lecture in the series Irish Literary Geographies, organized together by Faculty of English of Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań, Honorary Consulate of Ireland in Poznań, and Irish Culture Foundation. We have a very special guest tonight, two Irish diplomats, Ragnar Almqvist, Ambassador of Ireland to Hungary, Kosovo, and Montenegro, and Dr. Seán Ó Riain, Head of Political Section of Embassy of Ireland in Poland. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for this lecture. We have a very long list of questions with Liliana, but before we do that, we would like to introduce our guests. So allow me to start with an introduction to Ambassador Almqvist. Ambassador Almqvist joined the Department of Foreign Affairs in 2008 and has since served on posts in Stockholm, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. Before being appointed Ireland's ambassador to Hungary, Kosovo, and Montenegro last year. He's the son of Swedish folklorist Bo Almqvist and an Irish author, Eilishni Winga. I'm hoping it's close to proper. Sean is looking at me. So. Okay, but he was born in Dublin and he's educated through the Irish language. He studied at the University College Dublin and Trinity College Dublin, where after degrees in English, literature, and German, completed masters in economic policy and creative writing. His short stories have been published in the Sting, Fly, and broadcast on RTE radio. And in 2029, he co-edited All Strangers Here. This is the book that we'll be talking about as well during our meetings. 100 years of personal writing from the Irish Foreign Service. Very interesting anthology featuring work of Irish diplomats and their families, reflecting on the links between literature and diplomacy, exactly what we would like to talk about tonight. So that's an introduction to Ambassador Ragnar Almqvist, and Liliana, if you could do for our second guest.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our, well, not final, but penultimate meeting in the series of Irish Literary Geographies. When you Google the name Seán Ó Riain, the first thing that you see is Chargé du Plurilinguisme, Ministère des Affaires étrangères d'Irlande. And that's enough as far as my French is concerned. Then you'll find out that Dr. Seán Ó Riain holds a PhD from Trinity College Dublin. His thesis was on language planning in Ireland and Quebec. He also studied law. He has extensive work experience in the Irish diplomatic service in Germany, Poland, Argentina, Australia, Austria, and with the EU, Brussels, as well. So our guest spent altogether 8 years at the European Commission, 35 years in 6 Irish embassies abroad, and at the Department of Foreign Affairs in Dublin. He was also a lecturer in Irish at Maynooth University and served on interview board to recruit new third secretaries for the Department of Foreign Affairs. He's the current head of the political section of the Irish Embassy in Warsaw. Apart from diplomacy, his interests are in language planning and language policy. And I have to mention that this is a long list, but please bear with me. He speaks Irish, English, French, German, Polish, Spanish, Esperanto, as well as Russian, Italian, Welsh, and Dutch. I don't know anyone else who could speak all of these languages. Seán Ó Riain is also a published author, and his more recent work is Language Policy and the Future of Europe. This is Routledge 2023. Ladies and gentlemen, live from Warsaw, Dr. Seán Ó Riain.
Before we start with our questions, we have a surprise for you. Link with anniversary of Polish accession to European Union. Seamus Heaney, whom you all know, like all the fans of Ireland know this name, wrote a very special poem for the Day of the Welcomes in Dublin, and that was celebration of the accession of the 10 new member states to the European Union, including Poland and Hungary. This poem was called Beacons at Beltona, and 20 years after, this poem was translated in the national languages of the 10 states by the, this translation was commissioned by Irish Foreign Affairs. It was beautifully published in kind of like set like this, and there are 10 translations inside. And while preparing this meeting, we thought with Diana that it would be a great opportunity to read this poem in 4 languages. So we will start with Irish, and it will be a premiere translation made by Seán Ó Riain, especially for this evening. Then we will go to Beacons at Beltona in Hungarian, read by Ambassador Almqvist, then English for Liliana, and Krzysztof Schramm, Honorary Vice Consul in Poznań, will read the Polish version by translation by Jacek Dechnel. So I'm going to unpin us at the moment and give the stage to Seán for the Irish translation.
Many thanks, Justina. So Beacons at Beltona, I translated as Blaimena Beltona. Ishkrig le fion, tan tishke siler. Ach tom agus aimsig prevreilig na gregisha. Blaimen feminix a virnishka hansa. Barbarai a bestronsheri de chlus na grege. Anish tagach airi gachenia na redan tanga laurt. Nar lera an babas an gib uhu. Tagdish gona mua tangacha hagach tjoren. I'm shidish na gohana fragarha atá uhu. Mar vergrian funishka an phoenix hansa. Vi kunnig kla bjaltan lassa I genis I gonger. Gus baid ar ged tulori tachti guas. Inishke fion fokkel ashtacha a lerig gan vuil. Marshin la dogen nuisi chuin. Bich na villa vaile agus abremisht an fokkel na vestach. Mar is doeldung an sta. Bog biola, bog mionta, agus borach driana nua. Aul korhi na rauchan arsa, bin sle go bin sle. O vian vuer go muir huig, a tannev go salier, ar a vleimen phoenix vionushka hansa.
Thank you so much. And now we're gonna ask for Hungarian version.
That was very beautiful. First rendition in the Irish language of a very important poem. And just to give a very little bit of context, Seamus Heaney wrote very few poems on commission, to my knowledge. So this was a very special occasion, 2004. The location in Dublin in which this Day of the Welcomes happened was the Phoenix Park, which literally translates as Porcon Inishka, the Park of the Clear Water, but in Anglo kind of as Anglicization of the Irish is Phoenix Park. And the second thing which I love about it, as a son of a folklorist, as you mentioned, is that it references the first footers on the island of Ireland, the first mythological arrivals on the island of Ireland, which are the Tuatha Dé Danann. And they trace the same name. They're the kind of sons and daughters of the goddess Danu, who lends her name also to the river Danube, which flows through Budapest, the city in which I'm now based. So this is an attempt to read it in Magyarul, a language which I'm learning and can't, unfortunately, like Seán, claim proficiency in. Mayushi Magilak. Azishka viz és fion a tista viz. Marul bele nem gela viz gurug. A fionishgain felitzo phoenix tus. Idegen savu barbarok nebis. Badar besedut ben igagurug. De megtistult an yelv a caravis. Ayandakul rayuk haguturuk. Phoenix lang is fionishka vis-a-vis. Egmash savaba patog is churg. Abduntumtun a maglia mesitus. Hajoshok partra salnak eg durug. Lecheng is ertik mar mit mondavis. U erkizuk Lel tek hazat perug, an yelvuk, ish beseduk, tista is, megertve leni solni urumuk. Elmesh beseldunk folion mintavis, lobogunt minta yelu fen kuruk, tekien tet, tengeren semunk be nes, afionishgain felitzo phoenix tus.
Thank you so much. And Liliana?
Yes, for me, the poem is about barbarians, and this is what my previous project was about. So I do have a really emotional connection with that particular text. Beacons at Bialtene, Phoenix Park, May Day 2004. Ishke, water, and Fionn, the water's clear. But dip and find this Gaelic water Greek, a phoenix flames upon Fionn Ishke here. Strangers were barbaroi to the Greek ear. Now let the heirs of all who could not speak the language, whose babbling was unclear, come with the gift of tongues, past each frontier, and find the answering voices that they seek as Fionn and Ishke answer Phoenix here. The Mayday hills were burning far and near when our land's first footers beached boats in the creek, in Ishke, Fionn, strange words that grew clear. So on a day when newcomers appear, let it be a homecoming, and let us speak the unstrange word as behoves us here. Move lips, move minds, make new meanings flare like ancient beacons signaling peak to peak. From Middle Sea to North Sea, shining clear as phoenix flames upon Fionn Ishke here.
Thank you very much. And Polish version, translation by Jacek Dechnel.
Yes. Ogniska w Świętobeltan, Phoenix Park, 1 maja 2004 roku. Ishke to woda, Fionn zaś oznacza przejrzyste. Daj nura, zda się grecką ta woda gelicka, Feniks się tu zapola ponad Fionn i Ishke. Obcy to barbaroi dla Greków, dziedzice tych, którzy nie mówili słowami języka, których bełkoty były nieprzejrzyste. Niech dziś z darem wymowy przekroczą granice, by słuchać głosów, z których odpowiedź wynika, tam, gdzie Feniks dysputy toczy z Fionn i Ishke. Beltane płoną wzgórza, gdy pierwsi przybysze wytargali swe łodzie na brzegi strumyka. Ishke, Fionn, obce słowa stały się przejrzyste. Zatem dzień, w którym goście zeszli się na wyspę, niech będzie dniem powrotu do domu. Gdy przypadł nam ten nieobcy język, mówmy nim. Poruszcie ustami, ruszcie głową, byle sens się ziścił, jak sygnał dawnych ognisk biegnący po szczytach, gdzieś od Śródziemnomorza po północ. Przejrzyście, niech lśni, jak Feniks, który płonie w Fionn i Ishke.
Okay, dziękuję bardzo. Okay, I will pin us again. Just give me 5 seconds. And Sean. Okay. All right, and we can start with a very long list of our questions to our speakers. Liliana.
Okay, my longer question is for both of our guests, and I'll start with something personal. Right after I graduated with an MA in English literature, I spent some time in what was then Annan College, Northampton, and then at the University of Florida in Gainesville. In neither of the places, the people I met were interested in my work on Beckett, but always asked me about Polish writers. So after the nth time explaining that I was not really a specialist in contemporary Polish literature, I read contemporary Polish writers, brushed up on my knowledge of Polish fights for independence in the 19th century, hated the topic at school, read all the Czesław Miłosz I could stomach, and used my background whenever it was needed. Question: do you think that as Irishmen, no matter where you are, people will always make assumptions about your knowledge of Irish literature and Irish language in fact?
Maybe I'll kick off then and pass to Seán. I mean, yes, I think they're probably fair to make those assumptions in the case of Irish diplomats, and there should be a baseline understanding of your country's literature and language, ideally. For me, as I mentioned, my mother is a writer. So in part, while I grew up in a very literary household and was always surrounded by literature, I did what most sons do, and through my teenage years and early 20s, tried to get as far away from my immediate parental involvement as possible. And all of the writers that I love most were international authors, American Jewish writers in particular. And I kind of returned to recognizing the brilliance and depth and range. I mean, at one level, I was always aware, but of Irish literature, contemporary and past, and indeed writing in the Irish language relatively later, before I became a diplomat, but after I'd stopped being a rebel, let's say.
It's my turn. What Liliana just read out, it really rings a bell with me because on my postings, particularly in Australia, for instance, I was asked constantly about Joyce and Yeats and about authors that I had never really studied, because in my younger days, I tended to study authors in the Irish language, like Seán Ó Riain, Egon O'Rahla, and writers like this, which are basically unknown abroad. But I discovered that I was getting invited to various places in Australia to speak about Joyce. So I had to study in order to be able to speak about him. And I discovered this whole section of literature that I hadn't really known, what we call Anglo-Irish literature. But my first love remains literature in the Irish language, even though it's very little known abroad.
Talking about literature and popularization of the knowledge of literature, in 1963, Eileen Shorrock, Joyce's sister, said that she hated the Joyce bandwagon, but of course the celebrations of Bloomsday, the Joyce Symposia, which then so enraged Eileen, and it was 1960, so it was an entirely different world. But then it, in a way, helped to reawaken the interest in Joyce's life and works, and by analogy, Irish literature in English. So the question is, what do you think is the right balance between pop culture, Joyce, and other writers that are kind of now appropriated by pop culture, and the scholar's choice or scholars' uses of literature? Should we even make such a distinction? Is it important or is it not, as long as we get, I don't know, students or people understanding, learning more about Ireland? What's your take on that? Popularizing the canon, or even in the English language canon?
Yeah, I'm a big believer in popularizing. And, you know, I was a student of Declan Kyberd at University College Dublin. He wrote this fabulous book, Ulysses and Us, and would be, you know, very much an advocate for the understanding of Ulysses as the novel of everything, and Joyce's, you know, the great includer at one level. Ironic, of course, given he was a literary snob in many ways and deeply so. But it is the ultimate inclusive novel. And one of the joys about being here in Hungary, I worked back when I was a student at the James Joyce Centre in Dublin as a tour guide for a couple of summers, which was a fantastic experience. Wandering around Dublin, talking about Joyce and getting paid for it. Not very much, but notwithstanding that. But here in Hungary, they have a very special connection with Ulysses, in that Leopold Bloom, his sort of fictional father, Rudolf Virag, comes from Szombathely in the west of Hungary by the border with Austria. And for 30 years now, they'll be celebrating their 30th Bloomsday in Szombathely, the first in 1994. And it's a very broad celebration. I think it takes Bloom and that literary connection as a starting point, but then extrapolates from it and, you know, celebrates a broad understanding of Irish culture, and maybe in some ways quite a popular one. But it has lots of depth as well. And it includes academics and engagement and, you know, real reflection at a deeper level on the text and what it means. So for me, I think it's appropriate for a novelist like Joyce and the starting point that he had and what he developed in that novel in particular, that it should be inclusive and that it should brace a certain universalism. And while it's an intrinsic novel about Dublin, you know, we shouldn't confine it to academic kind of interrogation. It should be open to everyone.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, I would agree. I mean, I think I would be on the side of the popularizers as well. I think I was amazed when I went to Australia to be the first Bloomsday I spent in Australia. I was invited to Sydney to a reading out loud of Ulysses, where they read for 13 hours non-stop, no breaks for lunch and no breaks for coffee or anything else, just non-stop for 13 hours. Joyce was read out loud by about 84 readers. The first reader was Gough Whitlam, the former Prime Minister of Australia. Then I was asked to read the next 4 pages on behalf of the embassy, but I was astounded by, we read about half the book, I think, out loud on that day in 13 hours. And I was really struck by the fact that there were 600 people present, and pretty much all the time, when everybody left for a bite to eat or a coffee, somebody else came in, and there would have been at least 600 present all day long for the 13 hours of the reading. So it struck me as I had never seen this in Ireland, and I saw it in Australia, in Sydney for the first time.
But yeah, it's so interesting. That's such a it always fascinates me, and I think it will keep fascinating me. That's such a difficult novel, difficult on many levels, difficult for translators, difficult for readers, would become such a pop culture icon. In a way, because of Bloomsday and because of the things that we take from that novel. So even if we hate Joyce, and I do have some things against the guy myself, but the novel itself is just absolutely incredible. And also when we think about how it becomes for each generation, it becomes relevant. Today we have Bloom, right, who's Jewish, and then we have this whole chapter about nationalism, which kind of makes us reread the idea of nationalism. And so again, it becomes relevant in 2024, while it talks about Dublin of 1904. So I don't know, I'm always absolutely fascinated by the fact that what it has become. So and this is my last question for this part, then I'll pass over the microphone to Justyna. So yes, so Daniel Mulhall, for example, openly admits to using Irish literature to promote Ireland. And of course, we know that the knowledge of literature is useful in diplomacy, but perhaps, and this is a question for Seán, but first I'll ask Ambassador Almqvist how we should now in 2024, with the knowledge of Irish, perhaps pass on to promoting literature in the Irish language, or make it more known to readers outside Ireland. But what's your take on how useful is this knowledge or in diplomacy? From your experiences, we want personal stories, guys. We really want personal stories of your experiences in the embassies around the world.
Sure. Well, Dan was my boss for 4 years in Washington, D.C. So while he was our ambassador to the U.S., I was our economic counselor and cultural attaché for several years. So did a certain amount of his editing for what became his book on Ulysses and sort of his European, or his diplomatic odyssey, if you like, and saw firsthand how he would weave his own literary history and experiences of reading and reflecting on literature into his personal narrative and Ireland's narrative. And one thing I've always thought, and this is borne out by my, upbringing as a folklorist son on the one hand and a writer's son on the other, is that, very much like Seán Ó Riain, like Irish storytellers, like novelists, diplomats, are a type of storyteller ourselves, because at a very basic level, nations are collective stories. They're stories we tell ourselves and repeat and reframe and reconstitute over generations. And the role of a diplomat at one level, simplified, is to explain one national story in the context of the country to which they're assigned, and then also interpret the news stories that are being told about the country in which they're based back to their capital, and try and ensure a better understanding, I suppose, of the narratives, sometimes fictions, that are moving in either direction. I've always, naturally, and I think where it's done well, it's done authentically, and that's how Dan would have done it, because it came from his experience as a Joycean and Yeatsian very naturally to him, just as it would come very naturally, in particular for Seán, as a polyglot and a linguist, and also as our department's great advocate for the Irish language, to speak to his particular experiences with Irish language literature. But for me, I grew up, as I said, with the background I've spoken of, but very conscious of having a European identity in Dublin, because when I was born back in the early 80s, Ireland was pretty monocultural. It was fairly unusual to be an Irish speaker with a name like Ragnar Almqvist. I was saying to you earlier, my wife is a teacher, and the schools that she's been teaching in Dublin before we moved out to Budapest, there might be 30 kids in the class, and 22 different nationalities, including Polish and many others. So it's become a much more multicultural, multilingual society, and all the better for that. But in other countries that are less so, and Hungary would be a case in point, where the politics differs, the views on Europe in particular differ quite a bit from that Seán and I would be used to in Dublin, or from the state that we represent. I'd sort of highlight, for example, very obviously, that the closing words of Ulysses aren't Molly Bloom's famous soliloquy, "Yes, I said yes, I will, yes." They are Trieste, Zurich, Paris, 1914 to 1921, and sort of extrapolate from that how much this is a quintessentially European novel, written on the European continent. I mean, a universal novel, but Europe, and a celebration of Europe, and try and draw, in a more or less direct way, a kind of emphasis on how we have a shared identity, and that openness and embracing of migration. Liliana, which you mentioned, this question of nations, which Bloom refers in the Cyclops episode, all those things. So there's quite a way that you can weave your own personal narrative, your national narrative, and the literary narrative of your nation together. And I think when done well, it can help you tell a better story as a diplomat. And as I said, that's part of what it's all about for me.
Thank you.
Well, like Ragnar, I didn't work directly with Dan Mulhall, but I've known him for many years, of course. His wife, Greta, is Australian, and when I was about to be posted to Australia way back in 1990, we had some meetings, and they gave me a lot of advice about settling in Australia, which it was very helpful in that. But I agree with Ragnar very much that I intend to include the Irish language at all times. During the 90s, I was 5.5 years in Poland in the 90s. Wherever I was asked to speak, I would always recite a little poem in Irish. And to get some interest, I would take out a million zloty, the old zloty, from my pocket, and I would offer a million zlotys to anybody who could understand a single word of the Irish. So they would tend to listen very closely to the recitation in this. But I must say, I never had to pay that money out. No, nobody ever understood a word of the Irish. So it really emphasized how different, because some people would have an idea that Irish is like a dialect of English, or it's quite close to English in some ways. But when I would say to them, it's probably more distant from English than Polish is from German. This really surprised people. The other personal thing I was mentioning as well is that when serving in Poland, my second daughter was born in Warsaw, in the Wolskie Spital in Warsaw. She's a Warszawianka. And so I registered her birth here in Poland. And the first reaction was, of course, I follow the Irish language rule, my name being Ó Riain, but girls would be Ní Riain. And the first reaction was, this is very strange. He said, you don't want to give your name to your daughter. And I had to explain to them, that in Irish, it's a bit like Polish. Like I said, you have Kowalski, Kowalska. You change the endings of the name. We just changed the beginning of the name. So we have Ó Riain and Ní Riain. And they understood it right away. And they said, okay, can you write it? And obviously, pepper. And they accepted it, no problem. But I probably would have far more trouble doing this in London or New York, where they're not used to female versions of the surname being different to the Irish version. But that was something that's a fond memory, I must say. And Kira still talks about this. We chat every week in Irish. She now lives in Switzerland, but she hopefully will come back to visit Poland at some stage. She's always seen it as a place of birth, and she likes to come back here, and even to revise her Polish. Her Polish was quite good at one stage, but it's got very rusty because she's been away for so long.
Thank you. I'll pass the microphone to Justyna, but I have to tell you that it happened in the States when I got a letter from my parents, and it was signed by Czesław Sikorski, my father, and of course it's a different name than Sikorska. So a friend of mine who looked at the envelope on my desk says, "So you don't have the same name as your father?" Okay, well, that's so there was a whole story about me explaining why I do have the same name. It's just that I use the female ending, but so languages, right? Similar. So you have to tell the story to your daughter that I sympathize with her and the registry of her birth. All right, I'll pass the microphone to you now.
I have to tell you, Seán, that we have a problems in registrar's office as well with Krzysztof, with the second names of our daughters, which are Irish. So the lady couldn't find them in the list of Polish names, but it was okay once we explained the story behind. I absolutely agree that popularizing literature and culture is a very important thing. And even with Joyce, like our first literary series was called Taming Joyce. And we've met so many people, like we've met translators. Maciej Świerkowski, it was the time when the only second Polish translation of Ulysses ever was published. And we've met Italian translator as well, Enrico Terinoni. So we had like a whole year of looking into Joyce and Ulysses, to women, to politics, or nationalism, all those stories. But you've mentioned Ragnar's storytelling, and I think like we've all agreed that Irish are the best storytellers in the world. It's something which you probably have in your DNA, like naturally. And this storytelling, but enriched by your experience of travel and exploring various culture, can be seen in this book. For those of our guests who don't know this is All Strangers Here. This is 100 years of personal writing from the Irish Foreign Service. Very, very unique book. I know you both contributed to this book. Ragnar, you were editor as well. So can you tell us story behind the idea behind this book, and can you tell us more about your contribution, your literary contribution to the book?
Sure. Well, it all started in a pub in Dublin after our department's annual Christmas party. And Ulysses, there's this great line where Leopold Bloom thinks good puzzle would be to cross Dublin without passing a pub, famously. And one thing which is very nice about Budapest and speaks to its literary connections with Dublin is that the 3 of the 4 best Irish bars here, one is called Beckett's, one is called Davy Burns, and one is called the James Joyce. So that's a real literary link in a Hungarian city. But I happened to be chatting with the woman who's now our Consul General in New York, and a colleague who's now our ambassador in Paris and was then the head of our department, or Secretary General. And they were reflecting a little bit on 2 things. One was that we were looking ahead to the centenary of the founding of our foreign ministry. And then the second, just on the importance of writing, I suppose, to diplomacy and to work of a civil servant more generally. It's a pretty integral dimension of it. And I would have spent a lot of time doing speech writing and other bits and bobs back home. And then we got to talking about how many incredible writers there had been through the course of the department's history. And this is not unique to Ireland by any means. I mean, Milosz and amongst others, I mean, there's an incredible history of poet diplomats stretching back to Chaucer, I think, and includes, I mean, the city of Raoul Wallenberg as a Swede, as well as an Irishman. I always feel that very important part of Budapest history. But Dag Hammarskjöld, the other great Swedish diplomat, was also a fabulous writer and a gifted writer of haikus and other poetry. So there's this tradition most places. In Ireland, the civil service has produced like incredible writers. Brian O'Nolan, Flann O'Brien is a case in point. Kinsella, I mean, too many really to recount. Even a book published last week by a friend of mine, Ronan Hessian, who's working in our Department of Social Protection now. So, and Donald Ryan and others. I mean, there's a long list. But in our foreign ministry, we had some absolutely fantastic poets in particular. And when we started talking about it and thinking about it, we realized, as well as those who work directly in the foreign ministry, like Dennis Devlin and Valentin Ironmonger and others, there were a great many sons and daughters and partners of diplomats who were, you know, amongst some of the most illustrious names in Irish writing, likes of Maeve Brennan, a personal favorite of mine from New York, Yvonne Boland, you know, one of the really the greatest poets. And she was the daughter of an Irish ambassador in London and elsewhere. And I think, you know, we thought maybe there's a way of sort of honoring that heritage and that history, which is, you know, reflective of what we try and represent, that the diplomats travel, but they travel with their families. And, you know, Seán has recounted the story of his daughter being born and registered in Poland and always having that Polish heritage. And that's the history of our department. I mean, my youngest daughter was born in Washington, D.C. As I was reading, actually, was Milosz's. So there was like a sort of flow while he was cultural attaché in Washington, I guess, back after World War II. And so we wanted to honor those people and also celebrate what's a pretty quintessential element of Ireland's national identity and our ministry, I suppose, beyond that. So that was the genesis of the book. And then we took to the three of us who were involved as co-editors to kind of casting around and looking to find a representative blend, I suppose, of some of the great writers who had been part of our department over the years, and some, like me, not so great ones, but who were still, you know, contributing in different forms. So it was a lovely project to run. I was sitting in my basement in Capitol Hill half the time I was working on it during COVID, so it was a good distraction from the madness outside.
Should I go next?
Seán, yes, can you tell us about your contribution to the book?
Well, my contribution is very modest. It's just one poem, but maybe a bit of background I should give it. I've always had a particular interest in Israel from the point of view of the revival of Hebrew. I think it's miraculous. It's the only case, I think, in human history of a language which nobody spoke at home for nearly 2,000 years, and now it's spoken by about 10 million people. So it's a huge success. Leaving aside political and other problems entirely, but concentrating only on the linguistic side, I think everybody can recognise that it's a huge achievement. And one of the languages I learned when I was in Australia and learned very quickly from an Australian ambassador, Ralph Harry, is Esperanto. And of course, Esperanto was born here in Warsaw in 1887. And when I arrived in 1994, one of my first visits in Warsaw was to the Jewish cemetery, the huge Jewish cemetery where Ludwig Zamenhof, the initiator of Esperanto, was buried. And he has a huge tomb there where you see a large green star with the five, not the Star of David, but the green star with the five points leading to five continents. And so when the call went out for contributions to the new book, To All Strangers Here, I looked through some of what I had done. I'm not by any means a poet or I don't write creative writing. Most of my writing tends to be linguistic or language related to language planning or something in this area. But I found a poem which was an original poem in Esperanto called Aleudo Foririnto in Esperanto, and I translated it into Irish about 20 years ago for an Irish literary magazine called Core, an Irish language magazine. I translated it as Don Hiúdo Chadimig, and it's about an old man shaking hands with his neighbour. In the poem, I should say, is by a Dutchman called Lane Day. It's by an old man, an old Jewish man, shaking hands with his neighbour and say goodbye and packing his suitcase and heading for Auschwitz to die. And it struck me as particularly emotional, because sometimes there is an idea that Esperanto, being a planned language or being, some would say, an artificial language, but I would say that changed a lot in 5 generations, but that it has difficulty in expressing emotions. And that appears to me as nonsensical as the idea that when the telephone came to Ireland first, people were saying, oh, you have to speak English in the telephone, that the Irish won't pass because the telephone is made for English. In the same way. But what strikes me in this haunting poem is the repetition of one line in the chorus, which says, it's the English version, it's that I, the Christian, allowed him to go to Auschwitz. And the original in Esperanto says, "Que mi el cristano in lasis forire," which I translated into Irish as "God misha an Christi a ligdo emacht." It's a particularly striking poem, I think, and it's as I say, it's a piece of original Esperanto literature. And many people don't know that there is such a thing as original Esperanto literature, but there is. I have a book in English written and published in New York in 2008 of 750 pages just dealing with the 5 periods of original literature in Esperanto. It doesn't even touch the translations, but there was a huge original literature in all 5 continents. So it's one of these little hidden cultures that, and just to finish on that, this is a little book that I get 3 times a year, Literary Journal in Esperanto. I translated from Irish 9 poems by Seán Ó Riain, and those who read it in Esperanto then tend to be in places like Brazil and China and Japan. They translate it into their own languages. So there's a huge audience then for something which I translated into Esperanto, and then a Chinese takes it from there to Chinese or Japanese or Portuguese for Brazil. So it's kind of another channel of making Irish literature well known throughout the world. And it's a channel that we managed to be quite independent of English in doing it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. The book is in our library, and I think what was absolutely fascinating for us, like for Foundation, because we work so closely with the Irish Embassy in Warsaw, like over 21 years, is to have a look how talented those diplomats are. You know, we knew that Gerard Kieran is a great historian and he wrote a great book about history, but we were looking as well at the writings of Brian Earls. And I loved Eddie Branningham part, you know, his version of Eastern writing, which was hilarious. But I loved working with Eddie when he was here in Poland. And Ragnar, I absolutely love your short story as well, a very gothic one. So, you know, if any of you would be interested, it's in our library and it's free for you to read.
Okay.
Liana, please.
Yes, I'm interested. I haven't read the book, but Ragnar, you mentioned Ronan Hession. Is this the same Ronan Hession who won the One Book, One Dublin 3 years ago for Leonard and Hungry Pope?
Yeah, that's Ronan. That's Ronan.
Yes.
He used to, when I was our economic counselor in Washington, he was the head of tax policy in the departments of finance back in Dublin. So I spent a lot of time on the phone to him, and had no idea he was such a passionate literary man. When we weren't talking about tax, we were talking about football. But there you are. So there are all sorts of hidden gems, and Ronan is, I mean, a little like Seán, one of a kind. He has, you know, the deepest, widest capacity for reading foreign language kind of translations of any Irish writer that I've met. He seems to post something on Twitter, having read a new novel every night, which amazes me because he still has a full-time job at a very senior level in the Department of Social Protection, which I know he takes very seriously.
Well, thanks to the Irish Embassy in Warsaw, we had a chance to meet Ronan Hession when he won the award. And I remember when he said that he would do this work and he would get up and do what he had to do, but then he would think of what he would write in the evening. And it was just such a wonderful story and heartwarming that, you know, there is this very serious man who has a very serious senior level job who just, you know, thinks of the stories that he would kind of immerse himself into. And I remember his knowledge of Japanese literature. You know, he sent me links to, I was like, oh my God, I haven't read all that, you know. Okay. Anyway, not going off the topic. Let's go back to the questions. And I do have a question connected with a long or longish quotation from John Boyne's Water. But before I read it, I'd like to thank a friend of mine from the department, Dr. Aleksandra Jankowska, who actually decided that I have to read this novel. She brought me the book. And I do appreciate our little exchanges in the corridor and otherwise, whenever we can, our talks about Irish literature, even if it's just for 5 or 10 minutes between our classes. So here's John Boyne's Water. And the question about politics and politicians. The main character is watching television when a politician is trying to win another election, and he talks in English about his love of the Irish language. He talks in Irish of his love of Manchester United. He talks of his admiration for women. He talks of the EU. He talks of Emmanuel Macron. He talks of his cabinet colleagues. He talks of his RTA bias. He talks of Ulysses and the commitments and normal people, all in one line. And how Irish writers have given so much to the world. He talks of Michael D. He talks of the Eurovision Song Contest. He talks of the rise of populism across Europe. He talks of Ukraine. The question is, do you see such uses of culture and literature as a sin or a virtue of politicians?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I go back to that point around authenticity, I think. Deirdre Madden was a teacher of mine when I studied creative writing at Trinity, and she has a lovely novel called Authenticity, As It Happens.
Yes.
But I think where the connections are actually an authentic representation of yourself and your interests and your passions, then by all means, a politician, you know, they're human beings like all of us. We may not always think so, but it is the truth. And their role is to communicate and explain. And if they're speaking in a frame of reference that's clear and you know, representative of themselves, then absolutely appropriate. I think someone like our Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform and former Minister for Finance and chair of the Eurogroup, Pascal Donoghue, who I got to know very well in Washington, D.C., who was over very frequently. And he is a bibliophile. Every kind of 5 minutes when he wasn't in a meeting or engaging in Washington, he was in and out of a bookshop. He writes reviews for the Irish Times, you know, every couple of weeks. He's like Ronan. I don't know, Eshin, I don't know when he sleeps because he has an even busier job, extraordinarily demanding. And yet, you know, on flights or whenever, and every night he says, you know, for 15, 20 minutes just to unwind, he will always find time for reading, whether it's, you know, a contemporary novel or nonfiction or otherwise. And so I think, you know, in those circumstances, absolutely, it's fully authentic and fully representative of him as a person, and entirely appropriate to speak of it. I will say, I don't know the Heaney's, but I've met them, had the privilege a few occasions. And obviously we had this lovely project which we opened with that I was happy to be involved in initiating back home. And there was a sort of trend of a type through COVID years in particular, maybe accentuated by Joe Biden, who is a genuine lover of Irish literature, and particular of Heaney, and, you know, would always quote the Cure Troy. I heard him do it about half a dozen times when I was in Washington myself. But there was a period where it seemed every second or third sort of high-level political speech in Ireland had to include a Heaney quote. And there, I think, for some people, including perhaps for members of the family themselves, it seemed a little forced and perhaps, you know, inauthentic. And that goes back to that original point for me.
Thank you. Thank you.
I would certainly agree with Ragnar. I think literature is for everybody, including politicians. I could mention a little anecdote, maybe that when my first posting in Vienna way back in the late 1980s, the son of W.B. Yeats, Michal Yeats, was a senator at the time, and he came out for a week to Poland because his wife, Ragnar Yeats, was a very well-known harpist, and there was an international harp festival in Vienna at the time. And so I had lunch with Michal and Ragnar on several occasions, and both of them were fluent Irish speakers, so we chatted in Irish over lunch, of course. And he told me an interesting thing about his father, William Butler Yeats, that his father never really managed to speak Irish properly. He tried very, very hard. He said he would learn reams of poetry off by heart, and he would learn, for instance, Shena, Padre O'Leary's book, Shena. He would learn 20 pages of prose off by heart in Irish, but he didn't want to make any mistakes at all. And he didn't realize that the only way to learn a new language is by making mistakes. You learn by making mistakes. So because of his perfectionist streak, and he wanted to be perfect in Irish without ever making mistakes, he never managed to speak the language because of this. What you sent around, Liliana mentioned Eurovision as well, and just one small point on that, as it's been on TV quite recently. I'm always struck by the fact that Ireland has participated in Eurovision for 68 times altogether since the beginning in 1956, but only once have we been represented by a song in Irish. That was Ceolan Rá back in 1972, and I think that shows basically like that the democracy can be the tyranny of the majority. I think you would really need to designate a song in Irish every 3 or every 4 years. Once in every 68 times is not enough for a national language. Now, that's very much a personal point of view, but I think Irish tends to get frozen out because of the majority voting, and it's rare that a song in Irish will get a majority.
Yeah, but as far as Eurovision is concerned, I'm always for the Chilean gift of tongues, and I'm tired of English, and I'm kind of looking for songs in national languages. Why do you all want to sing in English when you have your own language that you can sing in? And look at Ukraine; they won because they a couple of years ago because the song was in Ukraine. Okay, yeah, that's a different story and a different meeting altogether. So I'm passing the microphone on to Justina right now, but I do think that language policy is here important also for the Eurovision Song Contest. And it should be, except for ABBA, it should be forbidden for anyone else to sing in English. Sorry, Ragnar, yes.
Yeah. National Library of Ireland did last year a brilliant lecture about Yeats' quotation in the politician speakers, the speeches, from politicians from all over the world, quoting Yeats, and on a different occasion. It was absolutely fascinating. But if you're talking about languages, I have a question directly to Seán. In Poland, there are 3 universities in Poznań, Szczecin, and in Lublin. And it will be actually interesting, Ragnar, to ask you about it, how it looks in Hungary, where students have an opportunity to take Celtic studies. Well, let's call it Celtic studies, okay, in general. So it will be either Irish language or Welsh, for example. I think Lublin is the strong, or both, yeah, or like in Poznań, but then I think Lublin is the strongest one with the Irish. I know, Seán, your first language is Irish, and can you tell us very briefly, I know this is a really huge subject, but what is the situation of Irish in Ireland at the moment, and what are your predictions for the future for the language?
Well, that's true. My mother spoke to me in Irish, so a native speaker in that sense of mother tongue, literally. I would say, I mean, for much of the 20th century, there was a decline in Irish, despite the best efforts of the government to promote it. But I'd say in the past 20 years, there's been a real change in that. I would mention just 3 events. The Official Languages Act 2003, the official EU status for Irish, which took effect on the 1st of January 2007, And the Official Languages Amendment Act in 2021, this has meant that public bodies and departments have to have 20% at least of their advertising or communication with the public in Irish. It has meant that on the English language radio and TV in Ireland, you hear far, far more Irish over the past few years than previously. And Irish is, it's very much very close to my own heart. It's the only language I speak to my two adult daughters, Aisling and Kira, who are now 28 and 31. But I think in general, the language has been strengthened. That there was much filmmaking, like on Colin Kuhn and others. The use on the electronic and print media has been growing. And there are now over 220 Irish language translators working in Brussels and Luxembourg because of the EU status of the language. So I'm quite hopeful as regards the future. I think it's a miracle that where we are in Ireland, between the UK on one side and the United States on the other, it's a minor miracle that the Irish language has survived at all. And so I think that we've survived it all, and we could take some inspiration from the success of Hebrew of being revived. Israel has a particularly close relationship, as we know, with the United States politically, but it doesn't prevent it from speaking Hebrew at home. It doesn't. Most Israelis I know speak English quite well, but their family language to their own children, they speak Hebrew all the time. So we can use certainly Irish more and more domestically, and know other languages as well for international work.
And Ragnar, what's your experience with Irish language in Hungary?
Yeah, well, I was hugely impressed, I have to say, having met half a dozen academics here who are excellent Irish speakers. And I was saying earlier to you, my experience of my wife, who's a teacher and a proficient Irish speaker as well, and we speak Irish at home with our daughters here in Budapest. But how often it was that kids who came to Ireland from Poland or from Nigeria or from China or wherever else, and didn't have the kind of baggage that many native Irish kids had, how often they were more positive about learning Irish in my wife's experience. And that would have been, my father came to Ireland, I said he was baffled by two things. One was our love of Gaelic sports, which he could never understand, GAA. And then two, he wasn't sports man. Two was the sort of aversion to Peg Sayers, who alongside my mother was the great love of his life, and someone who he spent much of his professional life trying to rehabilitate. And I will say he was partly successful in that. And it reflects, Seán mentioned some of the underpinning policy reasons, but we have been experiencing, I think, a little bit of a cultural renaissance in terms of popular appreciation of Ireland amongst a younger generation. Again, Seán's daughter's age, for example. And I mentioned Cillian Murphy, who won the Oscar for Oppenheimer this year. There's an incredible interview with his father, who's an outstanding Irish speaker from Cork, and Cillian grew up speaking the language. Paul Mescal, another sort of superstar young actor, using it very fluently. And Colin Kuhn being a breakout film, and Ian up in Belfast and elsewhere. The new kind of music movement around the Irish language. So it's enjoying, I think, greater recognition and appreciation that this is something that's an important element of national identity, and as Seán said, that we can retain it and develop it without losing the universality that English has given us. And I always look here at the points of complementarity and contrast with Hungary, similar to Israel in a different way perhaps, but there was a spectacularly successful language revival here in the 19th century, just at the point where Irish was weakening as a national language, and almost in parallel with it. And it has given Hungary a great deal. But the downside is, which is the upside for us of having Anglified, if you like, that we have this capacity to connect with America, capacity to connect with the UK. And I see it for writers, the kind of writers that you have been reading and speaking of. They get more penetration internationally if they're very good, much more quickly than a brilliant Hungarian writer will, or a brilliant Polish writer, because unless they're absolutely brilliant, they won't be picked up. So a very good novelist, it won't be immediately translated, whereas a very good Irish novelist will be quickly picked up and published in London, and that applies in other cultural spheres too. So you'd like to retain both, is kind of the the philosophy for me, and I think we can. And maybe, as you said, Seán, Israel is a good example of that.
One of the things we were actually discussing with Liliana after our meeting with Seán at the university last week is that we basically the writers writing in Irish, they are not so well known in the world. So this is probably something we would like to organize a meeting in the autumn, Seán, with you about that to give us like more knowledge about it. Like we will have an Audrey McGee at the meeting on 7th of June. So we are kind of like rereading all the Island stories and Peck Sawyers and Maurice O'Sullivan and things like that. So they were originally written in Irish, of course. Like we have a brilliant Polish translation of Maurice O'Sullivan, 20 Years of Growing, done by Ernest and Małgorzata Goraj-Bryl, then translated from Irish. So, but there is something in it. And you mentioned the Irish literature, and we will come to that because it's kind of it's huge boom in Poland for Irish literature at the moment. I think that's the only words we can describe it, but. What we saw, like the difference is that Irish government is kind of like investing money in the writers, so they can get money for yearly work on the book, and they don't have to worry about how to pay for your flats, or things like that. So I think that's probably the difference as well. Like Ireland sees that that's important, like helping the writers. Liliana, you have a question linked with new literature.
Okay. Many years ago, when it was just the interest was starting, we did this anthology of Irish literature in English. This was 2011. I would love to do an anthology of Irish writing and translations of Irish literature, and to have a new updated anthology to work. To have a source for the students, because not everything, as you know, not everything good is available online, and kind of having the kind of manual for Irish literature would be great. Irish literature in Irish and in translation, of course. But the question is connected with the work that the embassy, especially the Irish embassy in Warsaw, is currently invested in, which is the promotion of younger writers. So there's someone like Louise Nealon. She gets recognized with Snowflake, or many other really, really, really very young. It's like, for me, I don't even want to look at their dates of birth. It's just frustrates me so much. And that promotion of younger writers, I feel sometimes is this search for the new, the fresh, the recently discovered. And of course, when you have that, you no longer have the time or energy to look at the kind of writers which are called the recently forgotten. For example, John McGahern, William Trevor, or even Elizabeth Bowen, the kind of classical writers, Irish writers in English. So, what do you think? Is it important? I know the balance, yes, but what do you think about this constant promotion of younger writers, almost to the disadvantage of those writers whom we know, but again, younger generation might kind of easily forget about?
Well, I don't think it's a case of either or. I think you do both if you're celebrating and promoting Irish literature. I mean, John McGahern, yeah, there's a wonderful new film that they
but
made.
He's very much uninvitable.
Well, you can't invite the dead.
Uninvitable.
Exactly, and this is a factor, actually. I will say, as someone who's done lots of cultural promotion events and invited writers all over the world, different places, younger writers, like younger people, tend to be more mobile, also less protective of their time. I mean, I know because I grew up in a household where my mom was working full time in the National Library of Ireland, curating exhibitions, and also working full time as a mother, and also working full time as a writer. And she is a person who, she's written 20 books in the Irish language and in English largely. But the older you get, the more you recognize your time is finite, and you have to be guarded about using it. because writing time is very difficult to come by, and the energy required to do it well is extremely difficult. Even as someone who's pottered about in it like me, I can speak to that. And so you will find that younger, first-time novelists and short story writers and others, naturally, in the first flush of the celebrity of it as well, are more open with their time, and therefore more likely to travel and more likely to be available for panels and so forth. Having said that, we are so blessed with such an incredible wealth of gifted young writers. And my mother was from a generation of Irish women writers who had to fight very hard for recognition when it was a purely male sport almost. And so, to see the likes of the Sally Rooney's and Louise Nealon's and others having the rightful opportunity for recognition now is a sort of indication for me as her son, of her efforts and that vanguard of Irish female writers who were sort of born through the 50s and beyond. The other thing is that the best of them, and almost all of them, take huge inspiration from those same writers who, are very far from forgotten. I would say they all cite Bowen. I mentioned McGahern. There's an absolutely wonderful film now of The They May Face the Rising Sun, which is going to win tons of awards, I think. Claire Keegan, who is one of my favorite short story writers and novelists, she speaks continually to her debt to McGahern in terms of writing style. So, the tradition, the legacy of great writing carries through, and the great writers, the really great writers, are never forgotten. Sometimes they go in and out of fashion a little bit, but the best ones always come back in if they've gone out.
I was kind of thinking about the Polish situation, that if I don't drill the names like John McGahern, William Trevor, and others, then of course it's more of a foreign, of a university and a foreign country that has to kind of work and do the promotion almost all the time. Because if I choose the new writers, then of course I won't have time within the 15 meetings to do the older writers. So sorry, I know that that the contemporary Irish writers would talk about their inspirations, but it's just the situation of someone who has to teach literature, and there's always has to be a choice. If I do this, I can do other things, or well, the students of the new generation, how would they relate to the older writers, the ones that I called the recently forgotten, but the recently forgotten for us perhaps more than for you.
This is true. This is
Ireland.
True. I'm an economist as well, and we have the concept of opportunity cost, which is the unfortunate reality that you cannot have all things. So yeah, it's it's an embarrassment of riches would be my reckoning on it. And for a small nation, we're in a lucky position to be struggling by having too many good writers to reflect on.
That's true. That's absolutely true. Okay, thank you very much. And Seán.
I would agree very much on the idea for the need for balance. As they used to say in Latin, the gustibus non est disputandum. Everybody has their own taste, and some will like the newer writers and some the more classical. I think you do need both. But I must say I'm quite enthusiastic about Liliana's idea of an anthology of literature in Irish, with a bilingual anthology, because when I worked in Berlin, we invited 6 Irish language poets out for a few days and put them together with 6 German language poets. And there were 5 Germans and 1 Austrian. And the idea was that they would translate each other's poetry, basically. And we came up with a book. Then it's a bilingual book in Irish and German of poetry. The German translation, the poetry translated into Irish, the Irish poetry translated into German. So I could certainly envisage the same kind of thing in Poland using Polish and Irish. I think it's a brilliant idea, and I certainly, as long as I'm here, I'd be delighted to help in any way I can in producing such a work.
That would be great, and it starts with this appreciation of a few words like Iske and Fionn, and then it grows into something more. And so you can build on a few words with this interest in more and more in-depth culture. So that's why I was thinking about it. And of course, we would like to talk about it, about the Irish language literature in the future as well. So yes, so that would be absolutely fantastic. Okay, I'm passing the microphone to Stina now.
Okay, we are slowly going towards the end of our meeting, unfortunately. Ragnar, a question to you, because you've mentioned Bloomsday, which is extremely popular in promotion of Irish literature in Hungary. What other events linked with literature you organize as ambassador? Maybe can share some experience. And what about a situation of Irish literature in Hungary? Because as we mentioned, and Liliana mentioned, there's a incredible amount of Polish writers translated into Polish. We already have translators specialized in translating Irish novels, so that's absolutely amazing.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I mean, we have some great translators here as well. And I mean, one of the things I've been trying to do is support independent artists and independent cultural institutions. And there are some tensions, let's say, between the state and academic independence at times here. So there's a role for embassies like ours, which place a high value on freedom of academic independence, you know, freedom of media and freedom of the arts in supporting that. And we supported, a poetry translators workshop, for example. One of the poets who contributed or took part was the translator of Beacons at Beltane, the Hungarian version that I read earlier or tried to read. We had a nice event for Bridget's Day on the 1st of February, which was Beltane is, you know, the 1st of May, and these are all sort of Celtic points of the year. Imbolc, the 1st of February is sort of the traditional arrival of spring, and Bridget's Day has become very happily, I think, in Ireland, a designated national holiday in the last few years, and increasingly over the last decade, a sort of point for us to celebrate the contribution, not just of Irish women, but of women, you know, with connections to Ireland or none. The house I'm living in and where I'm speaking to you now used to be the home of a very celebrated Hungarian actress and musician called Katalin Karadi. She was kind of presented as the Marlene Dietrich of Hungary, if you like. And when she was here, she lived here during the late World War II years, during the Hungarian Holocaust, amongst other things. She saved a substantial number of Jewish families from murder on the Danube, and very tragic life herself. Subsequently, when the communists occupied Hungary, she was effectively ostracized and forced into exile, and traveled across to Brazil and then to New York. And a little like Margaret Brennan, who I mentioned earlier, or Maeve Brennan rather, had a sort of tragic end. But we had two writers, one both Hungarian, but one of them living in Ireland for many years, and one of them living here in Hungary, who's a friend of the embassies. Both of whom had written works of fiction reflecting on different aspects of Karadi's life. And so we brought them here to the residence, and they read. It's from their one of a novel to be published later this year. And we had a kind of conversation with the cinema and popular music historian on Karadi and her significance. And, you know, it was a different way, let's say, of celebrating Bridget's Day. But for me, living here as part of our story as well, a little bit, and a very beautiful occasion, really, in lots of ways. The other thing I'll mention briefly, just because I think it was such a cool project, it is Ulysses connected, but this is called Budapest Nagrani, which means the Grand Budapest Novel, and it's a work of 23 Budapest novel writers for each of the city's districts. And it was part of this broader project to mark the centenary of Ulysses called the European Odyssey, which takes in 18 cities. I think there are cities in Poland there as well. And Budapest's contribution was this Budapest Grand Novel, but it was also used as a project to celebrate 150 years of Budapest as a city. Obviously, its history is long, predates that, but the three parts of Budapest came together in 1873. So that was a really cool project, and it took as its starting point, fictional starting point, that Leopold Bloom returned to Hungary, and then the 23 writers each wrote kind of from there a sort of vaguely coherent kind of novel, but each with brilliant little pieces in their own way. And that's been a project that we're continuing to work with, little readings and bits and pieces from even at this point. So yeah.
Is the book translated into English? Or
no, we have a few episodes or chapters that we've translated, but no, it's purely Magyar at the moment. I'll send you the English of the first chapter. You can get a sense of it afterwards.
Okay, perfect. It will be brilliant to see. And some short questions to you at the end, and then we will maybe have some questions from the audience. If you could name 3 the most important books for you by Irish authors.
Ragnar,
well, Seán, you go first. Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. The 3 I would mention would, I mean, there are books in Irish. The first one is called it's Afioch na Haudische Cecht an Gaeilge, which means the revival of Hebrew, a lesson for Irish, just by Dr. Muirish O'Leary. It's an academic book about how Hebrew was revived, and it kind of clears up a lot of misunderstandings, because there's a very widespread kind of misunderstanding that, well, Jews were coming from all over the world and they had no common language and they needed one, and they picked Hebrew. That has some truth after the setting up of Israel, but the real revival of Hebrew happened between 1880 and 1920, when there was no state of Israel or anything else, and small numbers of people, and there was actually no lack of a common language. Over 95% of the Jews who at the time came from Eastern Europe, and they all pretty much spoke Yiddish. So the problem was not one of finding a common language; it was of making sure that Yiddish didn't become the common language, making sure that Hebrew would be used instead of Yiddish. So that's one I really enjoy. It's a 300-page academic book. Then I would say there's 6 volumes of a thing called Manual de Literature by Brendan O'Divlin from Northern Ireland, from Tyrone. And it goes through Irish language productions from 1500 to 1850. He gives good commentary and analysis of the various periods of Irish language literature through those centuries. And then the third one I would mention, again, it's a book called Crí Cinne by Seán de Freyne. Crí Cinne means the heart of a race. It's excerpts from 14 centuries of literature in Irish, right from the very beginning of Old Irish of the 7th century up to even the end of the 6th century. 597 is the first text we have for After Cholmkilla, up to the present day. So they would be the 3 books I would mention.
Thank you.
Yeah, and for me, there are lots to choose from, I guess. But first one, I love short stories. I've written a few, and read them prodigiously. And my favorite contemporary Irish short story writer is a guy called Kevin Barry. His first collection, There Are Little Kingdoms. He's just exquisitely funny. He's a sort of protege, if you like, of Flann O'Brien. I mean, he has that sort of deep humor and kind of sarcastic bite, with just magical use of language as well. So any of his work, but there's a vanguard of outstanding short story writers, of whom he's one. Another writer I love, not always kind of held up immediately as one of the top Irish writers, but he's lived in New York for many years, Joseph O'Neill. I think he's amazing, novelist and short story writer. Irish history is one of emigration as well. So, and some of his work, much of it sort of reflects on migration and migration flows, including this novel in Netherlands about a Dutch cricketer and a Sri Lankan living in New York. And he just has a fantastic range, and yeah, again, a wonderful stylist. And then I could choose a lot, but the final one would have to be from one of my mums. So this is 12,000 Days. This is a memoir of her life with my father. That's the two of them on the cover. And yeah, I mean, you know, every son or daughter is going to be proud of their parents, as I know Seán's daughters will be of him, and I hope my daughters one day are of me. But I am always and evermore a proud son, and it was and it remains a privilege to have a mother who's a writer and yeah, an activist in different ways as well. So highly recommend all three of those.
Thank you
Okay,
so
I'll
much.
give Kevin Barry a second try. I hate the Beetlebone. Sorry to say that. I couldn't stand this novel, and so
That's
he's
okay. I don't. His novels
last
aren't as
one-
good as usual stories.
But I had to. Yeah, I don't have that one. I haven't. Kind of with Beetlebone, he just. Yeah. Okay.
Discussing with Liliana contemporary Irish literature sometimes can be very tricky.
That's all right.
Especially when we organize meetings, you know, promoting something new, you know, but that's then interesting. It's interesting that we have all different opinions, we can share them.
But I'll give it a try, you see. So now I'll give it a try.
Read the collections. Like, I mean, they're all good, I think, but this is fantastic.
And of course, Seán Ó Riain, yes, it's everything he wrote. I absolutely love. So Seán Ó Riain, I would absolutely 100% agree. Unfortunately, I don't know any of the books that Seán mentioned. So sorry to say that that would be, especially the 6 volumes, would be something to yeah, to read during the summer vacations, perhaps, because you need time and space.
Do we have any questions from the audience? I know
that Katarzyna Gmerek was raising her hand, but we didn't want to break. So if you'd like to ask your question now, yes.
Yeah, just a short, maybe short introduction. Dr. Katarzyna Gmerek is working in the University Library in Poznan, and she is specialized in Polish-Irish history as well. So Katarzyna, please.
Hello, just wanted to say that I have been never a fan of Joyce, actually. I worked on the 19th century, later 18th century Polish-Irish relations. And so I met Brian Ayres, who was my great friend. Sadly departed in 2013. Visited him many times, collaborated with him. We even tried to write an article together. Sadly, that was faster. Brian was a folklore researcher. He was a diplomat in many Eastern European countries, Moscow, Istanbul, and Warsaw, and he learned all the Eastern European languages he could. And later, when he retired, he made a PhD about William Carton and the folklore, Irish folklore in the 19th century literature. He also used Irish language sources. He spoke Irish, I remember him. So his essays are still available on the Dublin Review of Books. Probably, I hope that he is mentioned in this book you have been promoting now. I am eager to read it because I remember my very long discussions with Brian, my swapping of many mails, visiting his Dublin house, and I am very sad that he's not among us because he could tell here very many his own stories of his own, but it is another country among the you know flowers and ghosts and fairies and everything he wished for. So thanks very much for this meeting.
Thank you, Katarzyna. I'll say, I mean, Seán will have known him well. Brian was a student of my father's. Like my father was involved in reviewing his PhD dissertation, and they worked closely together. And he was a good friend of my mother's too, and was many times at my house when I was a kid and a young man. And yes, a brilliant colleague. His work is there's an extract from the Sea of Anecdotes, which speaks about his deep passion for Russian anecdote and stories. I mean, an exemplary diplomat and dearly missed across our ministry. I'm sure, as I said, Seán, as a kindred spirit and one of the fellow polyglots in the department. There aren't too many of them. We'll have other things to say, but we miss him certainly in our household.
But I say that
very much. I mean, I knew Brian reasonably well. We never worked directly together, but he was my successor when I left Warsaw in 1999. He came from he'd been in Moscow previously, and we knew each other quite well. And he came to visit when I was in Berlin as well. So I mean, very sad that he's no longer on our side of the fence, as they say. But I'm glad that his writing has been included in the book, of course, in All Strangers Here.
Yeah, may I say that his essays he wrote for the Dublin Review of Books are still available online. They are in open access, so everyone can access them. It's very interesting essay about blood relations, about Dracula and Bram Stoker, and he of course mentioned very many writers, including Emily Waszowska, Gerard, who traveled across Transylvania. Brian's imagination and knowledge were incredible. I always admired him.
Yeah, he's a brilliant man, and the one of the best bookshops in Dublin, perhaps the best. Books Upstairs, is his brother Brian runs. So if and when you're in Dublin, or his brother Morris, sorry, runs, do visit Books Upstairs. It's a fantastic independent bookstore.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, Katarzyna, if you can send us the link for the essays, we will be happy to send it over to our audience and share it on Facebook as well. But that's something that I mentioned, that this book is kind of like, for many of us working with the Irish diplomats, kind of like an insight as well, into their work. Do we have more questions from the audience? Professor Buchholz, please.
As usual. Thank you so much for this intellectual feast. Always a great pleasure, and especially today. I'm so sorry to be asking my question in English, but I have absolutely no Irish, and I wouldn't even try. I wouldn't win 1 million zlotys, not even 1 zloty. Great in Irish. But yes, you brilliantly opened with a poem with a very famous poet, Seán. I think every literary person all over the world knows the name. And then somehow we switched to novels mostly, and short stories, perhaps a few. And I was thinking of how some genre, some literary forums may be at a disadvantage on the literary forum, international literary forum, cultural book market and cultural market in general. I was thinking, so the novel would be the one that would, the literary genre that would get most attention, would get translated into different languages. But I was thinking of other genre and other forms like theater. What is the condition of the Irish theater? It played such an important role in the political history of Ireland. What is its role now, and especially on the international market? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I can speak to that a little. It's still very vibrant. I mean, the Abbey was, quintessential to the formation of the country. Declan Kyber's book, which is one of the best histories of Ireland as well as of Irish literature, imagining Ireland, sort of documents the formative role that the Abbey and Yeats and Lady Gregory and others played in shaping a sense of national identity. It's not that today. It doesn't have the same resonance or impact, but it is still institutionally important. And yeah, Irish theatre continues to be pretty vibrant. The McDonaghs, Marina Carr, others, still producing outstanding work. You have this intersection increasingly of theatre and film, and theatre and TV too, which is obviously a novelty of sorts. And you'd see that in the likes of the Banshees of Inisherin and sort of other artistic forms that, what were originally writers for the stage have become. So I think it's still vibrant. It's still important. The Abbey has had a difficult, I'd say, decade institutionally, but theatrical arts and the form more generally is still in a pretty healthy place.
Yes, I just add that in Galway, the Taibhhearc has been a tradition of theatre in Irish, and it's still popular, still going on. And when I was a student in Galway many years ago, we were part of. We put on some plays in Irish. We had Cumann Drámhaíochta, the Dramatic Society. I was never an actor of any kind, but I mean, I had a minor part in this, and we traveled to different parts of the country, to Donegal, I remember, and to Kerry, and different Gaelic areas. There was a play called The Connerys by Lima Murrochu about two brothers who were exiled to New South Wales in the 19th century. And there's a beautiful song written in Irish about them, which Father Carol used to sing, and it still haunts me, I must say. It often comes when I'm shaving in the morning. I often, that song comes into my mind for some reason. It's a hauntingly beautiful song about the Connerys, about the two brothers being exiled and praying that sooner or later they will come back from New South Wales.
If I can add, we are trying to do an update of the plays of the Irish authors in the Polish theatre. And for example, in 2 of Warsaw theatres, there's Beckett right now. We have Ulysses in Poznań. We have there's Wilde in Kraków, I think. Martin McDonagh, I've mentioned, was extremely popular in Polish theaters. His plays were like all over Poland at the beginning.
When I was young, he was very popular
everywhere. So that was great. But you've mentioned that novels are like the most important stuff, but poetry as well. And you probably all know that Doreen Grofa poetry will be translated. Well, it is translated into Polish already by Jerzy Jarniewicz, and it will probably have premiere almost right now. It's published by Biuro Literackie, so poetry as well, but yet dominant novels. We are waiting still for small things like this in the cinemas. I'm not sure, was it screened in Hungary already?
No, it hasn't been yet. Yeah, so but I'm looking forward to seeing that here as well. It's exceptional, and yeah, Doireann Ní Ghríofa is outstanding. And that's a great work of sort of autobiographical nonfiction, I guess, if you like, as well. Her as well as her poetry, but she's brilliant. You should have her on. She's a wonderful person to speak to duality of language as well, and the role of sort of writing yourself in either tongue.
Mm-hmm. She wrote one of her poems were translated for action, Wiersze w mieście, which is kind of like an action in Warsaw, where poems are in the city. So one of her poems were translated by Jerzy Jarniewicz already. I
really liked her book, Ghost in the Throat.
Yeah,
I think it was an extremely enjoyable book. And when I served briefly in Argentina, we put on there's the poem, the Irish poem, which is based, I mean, the Queen Artilera, the Laman for Artolera, has been translated into Spanish, strangely enough. So we had a literary evening where I read sections of the poem, and one of the colleagues from the embassy in Argentina read in Spanish. But Ghost of the Throat it's one of the most enjoyable books I've read. It's in a long, long time, so I would certainly heartily recommend it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think her book has a huge fans in Poland already, so it would be great if it could be translated into Polish. And do we have any more questions from the audience? Then I don't think so. I'm just gonna have a look back now. Thank you so much for your time. It was a great evening of sharing your experience in literature and in diplomacy, and I really love that and really enjoy that. So thank you for your time.
Thank
from
you.
me,
It was great fun.
as
Thank
well.
you.
Thank you for
Thank
all
you.
the suggestions, for yes, for your time as well. But thank you for sharing with us not only your expertise in diplomacy, but also your favorite books and novels and writers. And Seán, thank you for your support for my little project.
It's been a great pleasure. It's
I
been a
do
great
hope that
pleasure.
it will be.
Before we met, maybe Anne, could I just mention this particular book? It's an anthology of 20th century poetry in Irish with English translations on opposite page. It's called Laur Nahachwala, or Poems of Repossession, edited by Louis de Puer, and it's certainly an excellent book, and I would heartily recommend it. And again, because of the English translations, it's widely available. But there was a predecessor called Poems of the Dispossessed, which was poetry between 1600 and 1900. And this is 1900 to 2000. The two go together, and the two of them are bilingual. In fact, with English and Irish, it takes on opposite pages. So both of them together. This is more recent. The other one was written in the 90s, as I remember, but this was only 2016, so it's a reasonably recent book. Again, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak about Irish literature. It's been a real pleasure, as it was a huge pleasure last Friday at the University in Poznan.
For us as well. Again, my words of thanks for the Friday meeting and for today. We really, I mean, I was making notes all the time, so I'm going to go back and go on my Amazon account and try. And I don't know Joseph O'Neill, for example. I don't know some of the works of the Irish language, and I am trying to make Justina participate in the class on the Irish language, because we need to
I'm all for it, but I mentioned to Seán
so Mira, we are going to win that 1 million zlotys because we will recognize at least 2 words in Irish at some point, at least.
Could I mention that Polish people in Ireland, as you know, there are well over 100,000 Polish people living in Ireland now, but when they do learn Irish, the pronunciation is excellent. That they have far better pronunciation than Irish people who speak English only.
Okay, so
let's stick to that, and maybe in a couple of years from now we will be able to make a few sentences.
Say one sentence.
We have soft fricative, Seán.
Thank you so much again.
Thank you very much to all of you.
Audience. And on 7th of June, you are very welcome to the meeting with Audrey McGee around the colony. Thank you.
Thank you.